This is part 3 of America's Secret Establishment, an Introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones by Professor Antony Sutton. Professor Antony Sutton has also written the two books that are pictured on this slide, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler and Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, which I will cover in separate videos. But for today's purposes, since part 3 is about how the order creates war and revolution, and Dr. Sutton uses the Hitler versus the communist story as his thesis and antithesis, I wanted to make sure that everybody understood that we were talking about two other books that he wrote before this particular book, The Order of Skull and Bones, was written. So, summary of the main ideas from part 3 of America's Secret Establishment. First, the order operates under the philosophy of the Hegelian dialectic, that is, out of conflict comes synthesis or change. The conflict must be engineered by creating two sides, pitting them against one another, and then out of the ashes, a new world order is created. It is important that the conflict be managed, not solved. The goal is not to solve problems, but to use them to further the ends of the organization. This is what is meant by the phrase, never let a good crisis go to waste. The Hegelian dialectic involves an existing force, meaning the thesis, which generates a counterforce, the antithesis, and out of the chaos comes change or a synthesis. This conflict must be artificially created and carefully managed in order that the order can control the synthesis to the greatest degree possible. To this end, the order encouraged and developed both revolutionary Marxism and National Socialism. And of course, we are taught in establishment textbooks that these two forces are opposed to one another when in reality they are two sides of the same coin. This is why international bankers fund both sides in war. It is all about benefiting the few. As Major General Smedley Butler concluded after 33 years in the U.S. military, war is a racket. It is about making a profit. That is why the order foments war and revolution. And I'll be talking about Smedley Butler and his book, War is a Racket, in another video. Once again, we see through Professor Sutton's research that the establishment view of the history of war is that it is merely the result of conflicting forces that are accidental in nature. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Sutton argues that war is always the result of deliberate actions taken on the part of those in control and for their ultimate benefit. Textbooks never seem to cover the topic of how these wars and revolutions are financed. When one looks into this matter, one sees an entirely different story unfold. Always follow the money. One of the most significant ideas Sutton discusses is the fact that communist and elite capitalists are bitter enemies. Instead, he says, no, Marxists and Nazis are funded by the same groups. The only question remains, how is this accomplished? Sutton's position in this book is that two main vehicles were used to this end: the Guarantee Trust Company of New York and Brown Brothers Harriman, private bankers, investment firm of New York. Both of these organizations have had members of the order among their ranks. Sutton gives the example as a thesis of Marxist Russia, funded by the aforementioned financiers. This led to the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. The antithesis is the funding of Nazi Germany by the same group of financiers, which leads, of course, to Hitler's rise to power. The clash between these two groups produces the conflict, World War II, which generates enormous profits for the financiers. The end result are the synthesis, which is the post-World War II world and the creation of the United Nations as the first step to creating an internationalist New World Order. That same internationalist order that Rockefeller, in the last video that I talked about the quote from Rockefeller, said that he and his family were accused of, and he said he was proud of it. Professor Sutton goes into a great deal of detail about how each of these situations came about in two separate books, which I have shown on this page, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution and Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. Suffice it to say here that he outlines the process and provides supporting documents as well. That's one of the reasons I really admire Professor Sutton's work, is because he relies on government documents and primary documents as sources. And that is, in fact, where we really need to go. If we're going to be true historians, we really want to get to the bottom of what went on. We need to look at primary source documents. And unfortunately, that fact is rarely stressed among students in history classes. The steps Sutton outlines in the process of the creation of the thesis, which was the Soviet Union, was the following. And he goes into great detail about each one of these. So if you're interested, you can get the book. You can even download this book from archive.org and read it. But I'm just going to go through the steps that he notes in this book about how that was accomplished. So first, the order pushes for assistance to the Soviet army. Next, the order pushes for the Soviets in the United States. Next, how the order developed the stagnant Soviet Union. Dr. Sutton has written another book called National Suicide, which I will also talk about. And in that book, he proves that, in fact, without the funding and technology of the West, the Soviet Union would have floundered and never would have become any kind of a power at all. The next step is the order is too powerful for the State Department to investigate. The order makes its own law. The order controls important law firms like Sullivan and Cromwell. And he also talks about what the politicians told American citizens, which of course is anything but the truth. The steps Sutton outlines in the process of the creation of the antithesis, which is the funding of the Nazis, was, first, the Nazis were financed by Wall Street. And there are a few other books that Sutton mentions that are also important to read, and they are Hitler's Secret Backers and I Paid Hitler. And I was able to find copies of both of these books. I had to scrounge around to find them. The I Paid Hitler book, I think I downloaded from the Library of India, which is where I find a lot of books that seem to be suppressed in this country. They're both relatively short books and very interesting to read. His next point is, who is Fritz Thyssen? And Fritz Thyssen is the one that is the character in the I Paid Hitler. He was an industrialist financier that backed Hitler with money from his industrial corporations. The union banking connection, and that's a whole nother matter in itself, because the union banking connection is also connected to the Bushes. And that goes way, way back. And that's, again, a topic for another day. Profit from the conflict. Much of the Chase Bank collaboration with the Nazis was only a very preliminary investigation of this was done. And there was a lot of collaboration between Chase Bank and funding the Nazis. But suspiciously, a very preliminary investigation of this was carried out and then killed on orders from Washington, D.C. Conclusion, the corporate segment of the elite profited from Lend-Lease to the Soviets and by underground cooperation with Nazi interests. Sutton also notes that the political wing of the order had plans for a new dialectic for the post-World War II era. So after World War II was over, this dialectic thing just keeps repeating and repeating and repeating over and over and over again. As for my comment, critique, and analysis, this section of the book really resonated with me, particularly because, of course, I had already read and studied Smedley Butler's War is a Racket book. And very few people are aware that General Smedley Butler, probably the most decorated U.S. Marine in U.S. history, was approached by a group of these elite high net worth individuals who were connected to firms like Sullivan and Cromwell and Brown Brothers investment firm. Smedley Butler was approached by this group of people, and they literally wanted him to overthrow the government of FDR and help them to bring in a military dictatorship into the United States. And of course, he would be the head of it. And because he was so well liked, they thought that they were going to get him to agree to this. Smedley Butler did not agree to it. Instead, he went to Congress and he blew the whistle. And there's a book called The Plot to Overthrow the White House. And it's all about what happened with Smedley Butler. And so again, you might be asking questions about why have I never heard of Smedley Butler? Well, because Smedley Butler, in his book, War is a Racket, lays it all out, just how war is a racket and what it's really all about, to profit the international financiers. So when looking for an explanation why wars and conflicts happen, I now always ask myself, who benefits? Because we know it's not the average American person or the soldier that's being told you have to go over and fight the Nazis, when in fact, after the war was over, before it was even over, the OSS was already orchestrating the bringing of Nazi scientists to the United States under Operation Paperclip. So the average American is told, go fight the Nazis. And then on the other hand, these valuable scientists like Wernher von Braun are being recruited to come to the United States and build NASA. So I've come to the conclusion that is definitely not the common person that benefits. The common person is just lied to and not told the truth about who's really funding these conflicts and why they're really being fought. For example, take World War II. The American people were told we had to go to war against fascism, and millions gave their lives to this end. But after the war, even the most ruthless Nazis, who should have been punished for war crimes, were helped to escape through the auspices of the OSS, which was the forerunner to the CIA, and also the Vatican. Why? Because the Germans were way ahead of the United States in their rocket technology, and it was feared that the Soviets would get this access to these scientists first. So then Operation Paperclip was born to whitewash the backgrounds of these people and bring them into the U.S. so they could, among other things, build NASA. That, of course, is a topic for a different video. But it proves that in the eyes of the elite, it was not about fighting Nazism. It was about profit and benefit for the very few. This is the same reason wars are fought to this day, for the expansion of empire and for profit, for the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about when he was going out of office. Sutton was correct. If there is not an enemy to fight, the elites will create one. All the wars fought since World War II have been unconstitutional exercises, because according to the Constitution, only both houses of Congress can declare war. And the only declared war, the last declared war we had was World War II. Every other war and conflict we've had since then was unconstitutional. So once again, the Constitution is cast aside in favor of the power elites who have money, wealth, and influence, looking out for their best interests, like, of course, members of the Skull and Bones organization. Both Presidents Bush 1 and 2 got us into unconstitutional wars, and both were members of this secret society. Both were also connected to the banking cartels, as Professor Sutton proves in his other books, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and also the National Suicide book. We, the people, always find ourselves on the losing end of the stick, paying the taxes so that the wars can continue. And last of all, questions to think about. How have the press and media been complicit in the fomenting of war and revolution and in the covering up of the real truth about who dictates this nation's foreign policy? Second, how long before the empire of the United States, with its 800 plus military bases around the world and doctrines like preemptive war, fails? And finally, why aren't we teaching the truth about who really funds wars and conflict around the world in our schools and institutions? And why is the work of somebody like Professor Antony Sutton suppressed and hardly known at all? That's all for today.